My analysis is that the anarchist idea of what a struggle is different from the fascist idea of what a struggle is. That a fascist struggle is understood as a struggle between two different bodies of people in which one attempts to exterminate the other. An anarchist struggle is a very different thing. It's a question of transformation, in which people with a different idea of what life should be try to supplant one organizing principle for the forces that determine life with another organizing principle or set of diverse organizing principles, and make that change infectious. I am full of hatred for our adversaries, but the best thing that is my heart is not the desire to exterminate them. It is the desire to create a world in which, at the least, they aren't able to cause any harm, and at the most, in which we get to find out if they really are capable of something other than what they seem to be.
Hey there, Fritzford here. This is the second and final part of our CrimethInc interview, before returning to our usual fare. We open with the rhetoric around civil war on both the right and left in the U.S. Our comrade and Ray wax historical about the uncomfortable realities of the state's role in both the partisan struggle in World War II Yugoslavia and the U.S. Civil War. Our comrade makes a hard distinction between actors like Harriet Tubman and John Brown and the state. We then examine policing in America as a continuation of the racist colonial project, as well as a growing global influence, and also the idea of a certain leftist podcast that the only two events of 2020 were the election and the pandemic, forgetting the general uprising against the state. The crime thinker relates on the events in Portland and their effect on Trump's loyalists in the DHS and ICE. We discuss QAnon and darker, more nihilistic corners of the far right, and the risks they continue to pose. Finally, we talk about antifascism in America, and the term Antifa itself. So I'll leave you now with our comrade, explaining his views of the American state. Enjoy.
My way of describing the situation in the United States in relation to what you were saying about a junta regime is that the United States is a colonial country. It makes a lot more sense if we think about it like the governments of other countries in the Americas. As a place where a ruling class is arranging resource extraction, and the natural resources and the population and their labor are all, sites of resource extraction, but that are fundamentally deemed expendable in a way that, that France, for example, has not yet decided that its population is expendable. That also explains the differences in the ways that the lockdowns have been enforced in Europe and in the United States. In terms of how we should relate to weapons, the rhetoric of civil war, which we've heard a lot of here, points to many different social actors' conviction that when the United States starts to break up, this vast near continent-sized country that has been held together by military force for 200 some years, that it will break into a lot of different elements, all fighting against each other. And the anarchists who think that civil war is the solution or the way forward you think that we should hasten the coming of this situation. They think that this will be advantageous for us, that we'll be able to open up pockets that are ungovernable, that are autonomous, that can be that can be controlled by the people within them rather than by the ruling class. My feeling personally is that if we can't accomplish the things that we want to right now, during these conditions, that we won't be in a better situation to accomplish them then. That if we want things to go well for autonomous social movements and for horizontal grassroots organizing, when everyone is using military weapons to fight for territory, then we had better make things go well right now and not hasten the process,
Yeah.
Based on, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've seen in like conversations with comrades over the past year, especially now with this like rhetoric of civil war constantly going on. I'm almost trying to ask people, well, what do you mean by that? Because every time you say it, they say, well, okay, well, yeah, I don't mean civil war like in Yugoslavia. We don't want that. I don't mean civil war like Syria. We don't want that. I was like, okay, well then why use the term at all, right? I mean, the right knows exactly what it means when it says civil war, right? They want...
I mean, they have a bulk right.
Yeah, I mean, they know pretty well what they want. I just don't see the use of even throwing that term around as much as it has been used in the U.S. in the past year. I mean, it just seems kind of irresponsible because nobody seems to know what they really mean by it.
It also parallels just in a very eerie and disturbing way to contemporary Nazi narratives about the balkanization of America in some ways. I'm not saying that it is that, but it does dovetail in a way that makes me very uncomfortable.
Well, yeah, this is the question, like, their narrative is a war narrative. Does that mean that, like, we are, like, super badass if we also have a symmetrical war narrative?
I had a thought now when you discuss this, like, leftist or anti-fascist fantasies about a civil war. Like, as someone coming from, someone who was born in Yugoslavia, there is this, amongst the leftists, there is this glorious idea about the anti-fascist resistance that happened in the Second World War, which is, I mean, it was quite impressive because it was one of the largest, if not the largest or second largest in the Europe, very massive. But also, like in many Yugoslav cities, you have street names and squares, still now even in some named after partisans and communists who died during the war. But most of these people who have streets named after them died in 1941. And they were like people closest to us in a way, even though they were communists or closest to the anarchist and left of today. In a sense, they were like people who were there because they have a certain idea about politics, ethics, ideas, what they want to do with the society and how people should live and so on. They were motivated by that. But they were also kind of, a lot of them were part of like the middle class intelligentsia or also workers who were kind of connected to this movement. And they were like, obviously not, they were very idealistic, probably not skilled as fighters, and also they were very enthusiastic and they supported the resistance movement when it was the worst moment to support it. I mean, in terms of maintaining their life in 1941, and most of them got killed. And this is why we have all these streets named after them. But what happened after that is that different people joined this, like from category, like parts of society that we don't even think about now. Like, for example, people who never had any communist or socialist or any kind of anarchist ideas before that, but who were members of a certain ethnic group that was oppressed or genocided by a certain Quisling regime in some part of occupied Yugoslavia, or like usually from the peasant class or something like this. So through these kind of processes, they were like totally not really connected to anything that we think about now. This became a mass movement. And not only that, but even because there was this other like so-called resistance movement, which was royalist, and then Chetniks who, like the Serbian Chetniks, who started as a resistance movement, but then they more and more started cooperating with the Nazi occupiers. At some point in 1944, the communist partisans gave them an ultimatum, like there is a certain date until which you can join us. After that, we will consider you a total enemy, but before that, you can join us. And en masse, the Chetniks joined the the communist resistance, like more than half of them. So, and from this mass of people, the ruling class of the so-called socialist Yugoslavia was recruited for. So, like most of people who were idealists, socialists, or communists before the World War, or members of the Communist Party, really died during the war, and the mass of the people that the new ruling class was recruited from were people who were not even thinking about any of these kind of politics, and some of them were even a part of the royalist Chetnik guerrillas, you know. So I mean, it's kind of, I think probably a lot of people who want something like a civil war, they don't think about these things. I mean, that you can end up now even they idealize like this Yugoslavia or something like this, without, for example, realizing that more like there was a greater number of members of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia after the war who were before that members of the royalist Chetnik resistance than there were members of the Communist Party who were communists before the Second World War started, for example.
Right. And yeah, I mean, based on what, you know, drawing on my comrades' experiences, at least in Syria, in the civil wars that took place in former Yugoslavia, also in Colombia, you know, and in other places where people I know and anarchists have lived through contemporary civil wars. My impression is that once you're in a situation like that, you know, civil war it's like any other aspect of survival in capitalist society, right? It's like sometimes you have to engage in it just to survive, you know, whether it's wage labor or like armed violence, but it's terrible. It's traumatizing. It's a waste of our potential, and it doesn't bring us any closer to the world of our dreams, you know.
No. And it doesn't end when you think it does either.
Exactly.
Right.
You know, and the one other reference point that I haven't heard any of us like say yet in this conversation about civil war is the Civil War in the United States, which happened 1860 to 1865, and did coincide with the abolition of slavery. That's why people, you know, can use the language of civil war and imagine it to be potentially liberating as well as destructive in the U.S. But from my perspective, if we really want to be analytical about it, I would say there were three phenomena going on, not two. You know, it wasn't that there was slavery and the status quo that was interrupted by civil war, and the civil war was what brought the changes. Rather, there was slavery and the status quo that was interrupted by a revolutionary process, you know, both of enslaved peoples seeking freedom, you know, like Harriet Tubman and all the different people that, you know, were resisting their enslavers and seeking to escape. And then, you know, the smaller number of honorable, like white people like John Brown who were supporting them and who were engaging in a revolutionary process that wasn't actually satisfactory to the ruling order. You know, so the civil war that ensued was a third process. It wasn't the fulfillment of the revolutionary desires of the people I've talked about. It was, you know, it was a way by which the deep state, if you will, you know, was able to reestablish capitalist and hierarchical, democratic, in quotation marks, you know, control of the society, reintegrating everybody into a top-down state structure, you know, and you know, with Abraham Lincoln actually encouraging Black people to go back to Africa just because he didn't think they could ever be a part of society in the United States. No. And he didn't want to be responsible for trying to bring about the end of like racism or white supremacy, you know. It would have been easier for him personally if they went back to Africa precisely on the cusp of the grievous colonial process that Africa was then subjected to. So, you know, if we're looking for a model, I would say that the model of revolutionary refusal, subversion, and resistance that is best represented by the efforts of Harriet Tubman, John Brown, and other people in those days, you know, Nat Turner, let's not look to the war between the states, which it exemplifies the ideology and the structure of the state and the kind of changes that it can make.
Yeah. So coming out of the topic of the American Civil War, we also know that historically there was a close connection between the cops and fascists in the U.S. But I'm thinking kind of the KKK, especially as a very interesting post-war and very powerful force in American white supremacy. So maybe could you talk a little bit about what the connection is today? Maybe if you could take us a little bit through this historical connection into now.
Well, really all there is to say is that it's just continuous. The police still play the role that the Klan was necessary to play at some points in the past, and the fact that a racially integrated police force plays that role today is not actually a step forward for targeted populations of Black and brown people. It's just one of the ways that a white supremacist system has made itself more stable in a time when when proportionally speaking, those who are perceived to be white make up proportionally less of the population. Now, the extent to which large parts of the U.S. police population are on the far right and endorse far right objectives. This is most obvious this year in how many police officers participated in storming the Capitol building on January 6th. There's a large number of police officers.
Or how many cops were also outed, in the past few years as being, members of various different far-right organizations.
Yeah, and they're wearing
squads.
Yeah, they're wearing patches that indicate their affinities on their uniforms. Not just in the United States now, but in Greece, the officers there are wearing patches from the United States. Yeah. I mean, we basically are facing a global unified police structure, as much as there are differences. One of the things that we've seen from 2019, from the uprisings that sort of came to a head in fall 2019, from Hong Kong to Chile, Lebanon, all around the world, really, to today, is that we've seen the structures of authority assume similar strategies of, just tear gas, and, mass violence all around the world. And we've seen resistance structures also assume similar tactics and strategies. So, this week in Myanmar, people are forming shield walls, with Circle A's spray painted on their shields, exactly like happened in Portland a few months ago. And in the same way, the police are also, worldwide represent a subclass within Capitol of people who have a financial interest. Their lifestyles and their lifeways are connected to the state continuing to enforce more, to impose more and more violence on the general population. The thing that's interesting to say, I think, about the developments of the past year in the United States as it relates to the police and the fascist-leaning population that makes up the police, and their dynamics with the state specifically, is that once a large part of the United States population revolted in summer of 2020, and the police were not able to resolve that themselves, it actually did fall to vigilante groups to get the situation under control. The situation really wasn't controllable for them until they had large numbers of armed reactionary white people coming to threaten or kill demonstrators by July and August. And what we saw after that in the fall, there was some pushback from the FBI against these militias that had mobilized and killed people in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and elsewhere. But the pushback didn't really strike the militias that had organized and killed poor people. The pushback struck the militias that, you know, they did one of these classic FBI entrapment operations targeting militia members in Michigan who had talked about kidnapping the governor, you know?
Right.
And what they were doing, if you can imagine the like far right and fascist militia movement as a tree, they were pruning the tree. They were pruning it to grow in a certain way. They were saying, it's okay if you organize to kill ordinary working people in this situation of surplus population, you know, and social unrest that I've been describing in the course of our conversation. They were saying, that's all right, but don't you think about trying to influence what happens in the halls of power, you know? And that was the, if you will, Ray, the deep state that you were talking about, trying to make sure that the militia movements that develop will be useful to the existing power structure and won't be counter to its interests. Across the board, what we've really seen over the last several months is that the United States power structure is not yet ready to break up into its constituent elements. You know, the center, where most of the force is concentrated, is still able to use enough force to reabsorb or isolate elements that try to break away. And that's what has happened to the militia movements that have, you know, showed themselves to be too far outside of the pale. But this is really just the state, like I said, pruning the militias to make sure that they continue to play a role in sustaining acceptable forms of white supremacy, you know, but that they don't get associated with anything that's regarded as extremist, you know, in a way that could make the state unstable.
Right.
I think that's the way to understand the role of the police and the state in structuring extra state policing. Mm-hmm. Go ahead. Sorry.
Right. It seems to me like in this kind of moment in which the police had a crisis of legitimacy, I mean, you know, doing what they have always done, which is kind of waging war on Black and brown populations in the U.S. Once there was kind of a more generalized upheaval against that, they were willing to use militias, but, you know, keeping them in line to kind of eventually bring back legitimacy to the police, which is kind of what's happened, right? Totally. In terms of, like, you know, going from Minneapolis saying that they were going to, like, abolish the police department to basically refunding the police department, and nothing changed.
Well, and the biggest talking point after January 6th is that the police were the only thing protecting us from fascist tyranny.
Right.
You know, I mean, you know, one of your questions here is about how people have, like, forgotten the uprising in May and June and July of 2020 and only remember, you know, the election and the pandemic. That's absolutely the plan, is to make us forget that the biggest event of 2020 was that millions of people showed in practice with their courageous actions that they had completely lost faith in the state and rejected its legitimacy and sought to abolish it through their own courageous actions with their own hands, not by voting for somebody, not by carrying a sign, but to make it unable to rule, you know? And the reaction to that, you know, there's multiple forms of reaction, right? The most ham-fisted, clumsy version of the reaction is revolutionaries, right? Trying to, like, seize the centers of power. But the other aspect of that is the centrists and the Democrats now presenting the police as the saviors of civil society, when it's actually the police who've been brutalizing us all along, and many of whom were involved in that attempt to seize the Capitol building.
Yeah, I posed that question because I was listening to this popular American podcast, and then they were reviewing the 2020, and they said there were like only two events. One was the pandemic, and the other was the elections.
Right. It's like you're a reactionary. You're the enemy, if that's what you think the two events were.
Yeah. I mean, I was amazed just from like a position like how, I mean, the leftists would just totally not acknowledge that the uprising happened, like, or see it as a part of what, pandemic or elections. I mean, that's so.
Well, if the framework, I mean, I call myself an anarchist rather than a leftist, just because the left originally was a question of where you sat inside the French Parliament, but a lot of us are never going to sit in any parliament, and what happens to us.
Hope so.
I mean, it's just, I mean, what happens to us is not a question of where your representative sits in the parliament. It's a question of what we can do by self-organizing, and the people in the parliament, they don't want us to think about what we can do without them. And that's why they tried to reframe everything that people actually courageously and successfully did in May. They tried to reframe it as something that could take place as a reform policy or as a measure that could be introduced through, a government platform that could go through some kind of ruling class implementation. And of course, that's not true. We're never more powerful than when we actually act for ourselves to directly make the changes that we need to see. And more people understand that, I think.
I mean, talking about reframing, I mean, it was quite amazing for a moment there to see that the slogan "abolish the police" kind of broke through into the mainstream. At least it was heard in the mainstream, like media or whatever you call society in America. But then it was quickly reframed as defund the police, and then criticized, like even this reframe, the slogan was criticized as being like too radical or something like this. I don't know, what's your view of this whole process of going from abolish the police to defund the police?
Well, defund the police was not widely discussed before May 2020. I mean, because it seemed more outlandish to think that we could defund them than to think we could abolish them, really, I mean, and I still think that's true. I think it's more irrational or ambitious to believe that the police will be defunded through the established democratic channels than to believe that we together, in a participatory and horizontal manner, create a society that has no need for them, The slogan "abolish the police" suddenly made intuitive sense to everybody when people saw a police precinct abolished.
Yeah.
And there was a Newsweek poll that came out, I think, weeks or maybe months later that found that the majority of people that they asked believed either entirely or at least in part that the burning of the third precinct in Minneapolis was a justified response to the killing of George Floyd. That means that at that time, the abolition of that police precinct via grassroots direct action was more popular than any of the presidential candidates ever were at any point in the entire election. So if we're talking about what the most important events of 2020 were, in terms of the events that people considered important or could agree about, the burning of the police station in Minneapolis, until this liberal and maybe left reframing device came in, until that aspect of the reaction hit, that was the most important and central point. And once that happened, everybody was able to discuss what it would look like to abolish the police, because what is terrible about police had been shown front and center, in a way that everybody saw. Usually it's just the targeted populations that see it, but everybody had seen it for a minute and had seen that it was possible to do something about it and believed that it was right to, And at this point, the people who had the most sort of lukewarm version of this, the defund the police people who were like, well, we need to make changes through the, pragmatic, practical, concrete changes, but recognizing the authority and the legitimacy of the existing democratic institutions, even though, sure, those don't really represent us. Well, maybe they will this time. That's, my opinion is that even if you believe in social change through those institutions, what they can do there will chase after what we do through grassroots organizing and activism. And if we chase after them, they will just run to the right. You know, we shouldn't be trying to beg them to do things. We need to be doing things and changing things. And then they will always come to us and say, well, we can make a version of what you're doing already for you. And if you vote for us, and we should just always say, no, we aren't looking for representatives. We aren't looking for somebody to do this for us. We will do it ourselves.
No.
I mean, the difference between these two slogans is also that, in my opinion, that the abolish the police that's not a demand, unlike refund the police. It's not like something that you want someone to vote for, like to abolish the police. It's just like a statement that comes from a deep ethical conviction. Like you mentioned, like John Brown, like a person that today, even now, is framed as being crazy because he just, from deep ethical reasons, wanted to abolish the slavery without any consideration how realistic was it in the historical moment.
No.
Yeah.
So I guess expanding on the police topic, we can take it up to sort of the national level. And I wonder if you can talk also a little bit about how the Department of Homeland Security, especially in the wake of Minneapolis, but also Immigrations and Customs, ICE, and their repression of migrants in the U.S., what is the current status of these institutions? How are they interacting with the movement and also the most, what am I trying to say? The most marginal people in our societies. Yeah.
Well, what happened in the summer of 2020 was that Trump originally wanted to try to bring in the military into the streets to shut down the movement. And people in the military recognized, as I was saying at the beginning of our conversation, that Trump was weak, actually. And that if the military was associated with Trump, the United States might not last for another generation. And so the military was like, I don't know, there's probably going to be unrest in the future. We may be called in to suppress riots under Biden, and we won't be able to do that if we've already suppressed them under you, you know? So they said that they would not do this. And Trump looked around for who his allies were in the government. You know, we saw him experimenting over the course of the summer of 2020 to see which state institutions were loyal to him. And it turned out that the Department of Homeland Security and its associated agencies like the Immigration Customs Enforcement and Border Patrol specifically were the most loyal institutions within the U.S. state, and the ones that were most likely to back Trump through a coup attempt also. Partly just for reasons of job security, because Trump was trying to channel a lot of resources into their hands and pump up their budgets. And they also are the part of the U.S. government that is most invested in the sort of racialized violence that the police also engage in. So, the Trump administration tested out deploying ICE and DHS people specifically to Portland, in the same way, actually, that the far right, the like grassroots far right, had concentrated their efforts on Berkeley and Portland before. Trump was drawn to do the same thing, sending his loyal supporters to Portland to see if they could suppress the unrest there. And what actually happened was that the people of Portland, the demonstrations there went from being hundreds of people to being thousands of people. And the different kinds of identities of the participants went from just being like extremely radical people and people from targeted populations who knew that it was really important for them to fight these fights, to just being sort of ordinary Portland dads and moms, And I mean, we can also make a critique of the way that roles within patriarchal society and middle-class capitalist bourgeois culture are reproduced and legitimized even when people look for ways to revolt, look for ways to struggle. Right. But what happened in Portland, despite those critiques, was really inspiring. Thousands of people came together and showed that, at least in some parts of the United States, no amount of Department of Homeland Security violence would be enough to secure the Trump administration if it tried to hold power, contrary to the contrary to the results of the elections, at least.
Right.
And I think, honestly, the coup that Trump tried to carry out was determined in Portland in August 2020. It wasn't determined in November. It wasn't determined in January. That was when we were watching anxiously to see how things would go. And you could read the future in the tea leaves of the streets of Portland then. And today, of course, Department of Homeland Security, Immigration Customs Enforcement, Border Patrol, they all remain intact as institutions and as bodies of far-right extremists who are organized to carry out institutional state violence against people without documents, people of color, etc. In the same way that the police that participated in the dictatorships in Greece and Chile are, in some cases, the exact same police who still are in the departments today in those countries,
Right.
In the same way that, the police in Catalonia that are, repressing the protests that we've seen in Catalonia in the last month, are directly descended from or are identical with the police from the fascist dictatorship that ruled Spain until a few decades ago. So, none of these struggles are over in that regard, and that we're just going to keep coming up against the same officers and the same state structures that channel our resources and our labor into arming them to do violence against us, and especially against the most vulnerable populations.
And more specifically on how state repression of anti-fascists and social movements in general in the U.S., how has that changed or developed in the last few years?
Well, I don't know, pretty early on in the revolt of 2020, 13,000 people had been arrested, and it was a lot, and hundreds were facing felony charges involving years in prison, and some of us are still facing felony charges. But the U.S. justice system, so-called justice system, the court system, has also been completely overwhelmed by crisis. You can really see the ways in which we're in a sort of a slipshod colonial state in the breakdowns of basic functioning of the judicial process here, that they just haven't been able to charge a lot of people, and they've had to drop a lot of charges against people just because they're not organized enough, and they don't have the facilities to keep people. Again, I think that the most important resistance to the intensification of repression actually happened at the beginning of the Trump regime, on the first day of the Trump regime, when 500 or 1,000 anarchists participated in a black bloc in Washington, D.C., depending on who you qualify as an anarchist and what you qualify as a black bloc. And 250 people were arrested. Like I said, they were all charged with 8 felonies or more apiece,
Right. Yeah.
And faced 80 years in prison or more, each of them, and that court case, that was an effort to shift what policing would look like under Trump to a fascist model, where if you were in the vicinity of a public demonstration, you could spend the rest of your life in prison, But through like serious organizing and solidarity and people refusing to navigate that situation individually, but choosing to fight together, in the end, they weren't able to pin any of those charges on people, and almost nobody did any jail time even. In the United States, having a union now is much less meaningful than it was 100 years ago, because there's so much volatility in the job market that you really can't get a lot of collective bargaining power. But in a post-industrial economy, where you can still wield power by collective organizing is defending yourself as one of many people charged with crimes. So, collective bargaining is still important, but we're not going to have jobs anymore. We're just going to have charges. That's the future for the U.S. working class.
Yeah, both credit and criminal.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
I mean, so we saw the implosion of the so-called alt-right that characterized the the beginning of the Trump regime in some way. I mean, it imploded in this series of kind of pretty bizarre events that involved the leaders of the alt-right. But then after that, we saw the rise of different kind of fascist tendencies in the US, one of which is the internet-based movement called QAnon. So how do you see this development?
I mean, when looking at it in context, one of the ways to interpret this is that at the beginning of the conversation, I was saying that the far right, they don't have any creativity of their own, so they are always appropriating narratives or structural, strategic elements from the left or the anarchists, you know?
And if not from that, from like Star Wars and Wicca or something. Yeah. Very derivative as a people.
And, you know, this like weird narrative, it's sort of a millennial narrative in which, you know, we're about to be rescued by a messiah or something, right?
By Rambo Trump and
right.
Yeah. What was nice for me about QAnon, you know, is that it is actually so passive, you know. It almost seems like the work of like a deep state or something, and that it encourages people to just trust the plan and just keep paying attention, you know.
Really?
I mean, what comes next is going to be much worse because it will probably, you know, focus people on what their agency is and what they can do rather than, you know, just trying to keep people paying attention. But, you know, QAnon emerged from an attention economy, and, you know, on 4chan, 8chan. Yeah. And, you know, and it is like, I mean, it built on the 9/11 truth movement and all of these previous sort of typically American conspiracy theory movements in which there's like a mystical faith is invested in the power of information itself, which from my perspective is like intentionally paralyzing, just because we already know everything we need to know. Everything is happening right in front of our faces. You know, if you're not convinced that it's time to do something by what you can already see when you're struggling to pay your rent, and, you know, and your landlord owns 10 houses, and, you know, if you can't see it, then more information is just like, you're like a weird addict who is actually consuming information to avoid having to arrive at the point of deciding to act, to do something, you know? I mean, in that case, in that context, more information is needed to confuse people more, not to clarify matters. You know, right. The interesting thing about QAnon is that it wasn't really mobilizing, you know? It like, or at least it didn't prioritize mobilization. You know, some of us like watched the QAnon stuff up close, and it seems like it was really, some of it was geared towards the elements of Trump's base that are not like active duty, you know, that were like, because a lot of Trump's base is like elderly people, you know, and just like targeting these people so they could just think that something magic was about to happen that would take care of everything, which is really not the kind of
it's kind of a way of like rationalizing the failures that were going to happen.
Yeah, totally. It was not the millennial urgency they needed to like whip millions of people into supporting a coup attempt.
Yeah.
But I don't want to Monday morning quarterback their errors for them and help them like formulate a more effective program.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You know, we never want to offer tips on this show.
To be fair, though, it'd be hard not to organize a more effective program. It's pretty lacking.
Well, I mean, they did get everybody to pay attention, and, you know, I mean, like in the mid 20th century, corporations had a 10-year plan. Now, even the biggest corporations only plan a couple months ahead in the future, right? I mean, or a couple years at the very, very most, just because the market is so volatile. And I think that just getting people to pay attention was as much as anybody was able to think about what, you know, how to do on the far right side.
Sure.
You know, what's interesting about this again is like, if you go back to the end of the 20th century, the people who were introducing like weird creative ideas about an alternate reality or something, or hidden secrets within this reality, you know, was like the Matrix movies, like Fight Club, Dark City, all of these movies that came out in those days that kind of suggested that reality was not what it seemed, and that, seemed to have like radical implications.
Right. Yeah.
If there's a problem for us, it's that that we are not the ones right now who are catering to the utopian aspirations and curiosities of the population. We have mobilized to respond to emergencies, but we don't have an inspiring or elevating, fantastical narrative to inspire people with visions of a better world right now. Between the like pragmatic left that's like, well, maybe we really could get like a really good like healthcare for everybody, and then the anarchists who were like, well, maybe everything that exists could be destroyed, and I can't see any further than that, frankly. We need to have a creative and fanciful vision. Even now at the end of the world, especially at the end of the world, so that we can imagine what we could be seeking next.
But
and draw people into that.
But one that's not very like super defined, like we don't need a utopian vision. Like
not a prescription, absolutely not. But I mean, nowadays, it used to be when I was younger, people would say, well, and what's your blueprint? We would say, no blueprint. We have to work it out together, And now the person that you're saying we have to work it out together with, they're like, well, I can't see anything. I can't see anything at all. Can you propose anything? And you're like, a Food Not Bombs program. It would help us to be able to propose more templates, but I absolutely agree that we shouldn't do this prescriptively.
But also, reading history is not a bad idea. Like, because in the beginning you said that, like, as a young person you was like a punk who was reading Nietzsche and things like this. And so recently I was reading this book called, it was written by an American, I think, author called Left-Wing Nietzscheans. I don't know if you know about this book.
I haven't read it.
Yeah, it's about the politics of the expressionist movement in the Germany in like the 20s and 30s. And the left kind of more radical politics of the expressionist movement. And it's very interesting because it's like totally like a lot of them, like most of them consider themselves to be communists. Some were anarchists, but it's really, it's like reading something from like a parallel universe, It's like, because it has nothing to do with today's references, because like they're like communists who are into Nietzsche, and then they have like, from that point of view, which is not like completely rational, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but they're trying to figure out some better way of living, So,
Emma Goldman was a communist who was into Nietzsche. It's not that far from our common reference points.
Yeah. So there is a lot of more options out there, like also in socialist anarchist history than people really think there are. Like,
absolutely.
But moving forward too, you've also mentioned a proliferation of mutual aid endeavors and these responses to these constant emergencies, and certainly these also provide durable templates.
Well, right now,
something like a vision.
Right now, we're going to find out. We're in the aftermath of a year of crisis, and some of these projects will collapse. This is the time for everybody to fight each other, and to
things end.
Yeah, but
it's all right.
But whatever survives from here will be the infrastructure that we have to work from in the future, and
that layer of sediment you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. My hope is that people will recognize the importance of preserving everything that they've built, even as our lives hopefully get a tiny bit easier here with the easing of the pandemic and the setbacks that have afflicted the fascist movement and that give us a little bit of breathing room. Like that creates a situation which, we also need to be able to refocus a little bit, and rather than just constantly reacting to emergencies and imagining that the only thing that we need to know how to do is like break things or fight police or whatever, that we actually in this situation need to be able to advance more models for connection and for like fostering the kind of relations that, and like joy that people lack in their lives.
Yeah. Maybe a rereading of Kropotkin wouldn't hurt. While you're
Sure. I mean, if we understand Kropotkin broadly, like Kropotkin was also the basis for Alcoholics Anonymous, like,
Oh, I didn't know that actually.
Well, I'd say organizations since then that have even abandoned Alcoholics Anonymous have moved very much towards mutual aid and like equal mutual aid without leaders, without these kind of, speaker to audience sort of interactions.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, man, I hate to make a downer of a question after this little bright corner we found in this otherwise very, very serious discussion we've been having. But we should point out that even though QAnon has sort of captured the American imagination right now, it's very, very far from the darkest corner here. There's a lot of new nihilistic Nazi groups, such as the Atomwaffen and the Base, that are openly embracing mass shooting, Satanism, bragging about pedophilia, and perhaps worse, if we can imagine that. And it's a very chaotic and dark scene at the bottom of this barrel here. And I'm really wondering if you've had any interactions with any of these people, and how do you see them sort of in general now? What's their threat level today, your sense of their activity?
Well, I think the whole far right, not just the extreme cases that you've just described, are in a period of defeat right now, defeat and confusion. Not that their project has been defeated, just that they don't know how to handle the new situation. And I think that is indicative of their of the inexperience of their movement. If you're an anarchist, after you've been active for a couple of years, you've had at least one experience where everybody was saying that you were the Antichrist, and and like anarchists want to eat your children is on the cover of every newspaper or whatever,
or that they want to throw feces-filled water balloons.
Right.
At,
exactly. I mean, I remember
AIDS blood.
21 years ago at the Republican National Convention was in Philadelphia, and police alleged that anarchists had brought a bus full of exotic animals into Philadelphia that they were going to use to just attack random like Republicans. But actually the police
that's 12 monkeys. That's just one. Yeah.
They had pulled over a bus that was transporting animals for a zoo, but it didn't have anything to do with an anarchist plot. But if you're an anarchist, you're just used to having these kind of setbacks where like suddenly the entire society is against you and the media cycle is against you, and you have felony charges and your lawyer is telling you you're probably going to do a lot of prison time.
I mean, that's all you expect, basically.
Yeah, that's what you get involved for it. You're just like, oh, good, everything's going like I thought it would. But for the far right, like 1 minute their like beloved leader was in office and was telling them he was going to rule forever, and that they were going to just get to hang out with him in the Capitol building and drink the blood of the like Democrats. And the next minute, they're on the news being described as terrorists, which is not what they thought they were, and so they're just in total defeat. They don't know how to handle it. They were totally shocked, and we'll see them recover from this, but right now they're in disarray as a result because their conditions have just changed so fast and they haven't figured out how to.
But we also like what Fritz, the question that he posed is also about this faction of the fascist movement that kind of embraces this role of a boogeyman, of a terrorist, of like a totally nihilist kind of position.
Yeah. Well, those people are dangerous because they're the ones that I anticipate will carry out individual attacks, especially after the pandemic recedes more, and there's more like targets. What we desperately need in the United States is public spaces where people can share their lives. The United States is a very isolated, individualized place, much more so than any European country, maybe more so than anywhere I've been, where everybody is just hyper individualized. And we need to be able to have like common spaces where we can just develop our social skills and develop the ability to think of ourselves as part of something bigger than just individuals with our, with our CVs and our, different job every month. And, maybe the number of Twitter followers you have or something, to be able to think of ourselves as part of a social body, and my fear is that, the terrorists will try to make that impossible just by attacking, those kind of spaces. So as I was saying earlier in the conversation about the development of car blockades to protect demonstrations after the attack in Charlottesville, we will have to continue to innovate ways to keep our social centers safe and to keep our social gatherings safe. But I really hope that people will prioritize figuring out how to make it easy and safe for people to come together, because we need that here.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need it everywhere. I mean, I think that one thing that this last year has shown us is that in kind of isolation, a lot of people have been thinking about a lot of things, coming up with different ideas, both on our side and from the Nazis, which has been shown in various different countries now. There's been far right kind of vanguards and protests all over the world, but there's also been glimmers of hope from our side as well. So I mean, everybody's been sitting on their ass at home thinking about what to do next, and hopefully, after all this shit, we'll be able to come together and fucking do something.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that's one of the tremendous opportunities in front of us right now, is that everybody has been longing for the opportunity to be connected with others. And hopefully when we come back together, if anarchists and others have proposals, not just for what we want to destroy or resist, but for what we could create together, that this could be a really good time for us to find a lot of people who want those, and it's become very difficult to dream, especially in the course of all of this scary and dangerous work that we've had to do. But we should have inspiring and romantic proposals for what our lives could be together. And, and those should be undimmed by, the prospect of us getting killed. Actually, the risks just make it more important that we don't put off the things that we most want.
So, maybe we can close off with, going back to the beginning in a way, and talk about the anti-fascism and also the word Antifa. So, I mean, in the recent years, the word Antifa became a household word for the American public. So it was used as a weapon to attack anti-fascists by the Trump administration and later by the liberals, even to say that the people who, the fascists or the right-wing people or the misled people who occupied the Capitol were Antifa somehow, anarchists. So it was used, again, speaking from an outsider perspective, it was used as instead of this old term of outside agitator or whatever the term is that was used in the 60s by FBI. That would be one part of the question, how do you comment on these things? And then the other, you can maybe expand on but various relatively obscure but present critiques of coming from the Italian ultra-left critiques of anti-fascism that pose that anti-fascism as movement obscures the necessity of struggle against the state, capitalism, and in a way it's a move into a more reformist direction.
It's true that, at the beginning of all of this, in 2015, anti-fascism was still a very small phenomenon in the United States. We had the traditions of anti-fascism that we had inherited from the 1980s and 1990s, which is basically groups of punks and skinheads fighting, as a very sort of marginal thing. And every once in a while, anti-fascists would fight fascists, or fascists would carry out an attack or something, but it was not a central issue. When Trump was elected, there was a bunch of discussion about whether Trump represented fascism. And if we have a robust and thoroughgoing understanding of what fascism arises from and its historical roots, if we understand how Hitler was inspired, for example, by the race laws in the South, we can see that there are currents in the United States that, tie racism here to fascism overseas to contemporary fascist movements here. And it makes sense to fight against them. But nobody had really thought about fascism as a serious threat. As I said earlier in the conversation, nobody had really thought about that till Charlottesville, really.
Right.
But when Trump was elected, anarchists and other rebels who were sort of early adopters, everybody was suddenly registering new Antifa handles on Twitter. I was kind of critical of this, honestly. Antifa is a word from Germany. In the United States, if you say you're Antifa, it still kind of sounds like you're saying you're like a Martian.
Yes.
It's not a word that sounds familiar. If you say you're anti-racist, people are like, well, yeah, I mean, and I think that if the far right had been trying to make anti-racism into the bugaboo with which they could scare everybody, that would have been very hard for them. They're like, those fucking anti-racists who just want to beat up your grandmother. It's like, well, I don't know.
They would have just called them anti-Ra.
Yeah, they would have had to do that, but for us to do that for them was a mistake. It was kind of like borrowed glory. We're like the real German Antifa, which is like people were able to form like a youth subculture out of it or something. But I think that's it centralized the wrong question, and it did so in a way that made it possible for the far right to turn us into a target, to ascribe an identity to us and turn us into a target. And the question is, should we have fascism? Well, no. But the problem with that question is that there's some other things that need to be said. No, actually, should we have capitalism? No. Should we have patriarchy? No. Like the Black Bloc at the inauguration of Donald Trump was the anti-fascist and anti-capitalist Black Bloc. It was an effort to center anti-capitalism as well as anti-fascism. But over the next couple of years, fascism got centered, and this happens for a couple different interrelated reasons. If it's easier to get allies when you talk about being against fascism and being against capitalism, if there's liberals who are also against fascism, but see your opposition to capitalism as evidence that you're, just as much of a terrorist as the far right or whatever, So it just became really easy to, and especially once the far right was like, no, they're Antifa, which is the word for fascist, then you're like, well, no, anti-fa means anti-fascist. Actually, you just get drawn deeper and deeper into these conversations, and the threat, the risk of getting sucked into that kind of rhetoric is it can diminish the complexity of our thinking about what kind of social change we're trying to seek, and that it seems like we're trying to defend society as it exists from something outside it, when actually everyone knows that society has to change. Everyone knows society has to change, and seeming to be the ones preserving it you're on an eroding middle ground, as everybody floods to the margins on one side or the other. We actually need to be proposing a change. If we only seem like what we have to offer is that we are opposing the proposals of the far right, then the next generation is going to be like, well, there needs to be a change. We can either go with the ones who are trying to defend the existing order, or we can change something. And who's trying to change something? Well, it seems like the fascists. That's what they were going for. Fascists wanted to seem like the dynamic ones, and for us to seem like the reactive ones who they want to say are in the pocket of the ruling order, the deep state, which is absurd because we've been fighting, with all we've got against capitalists and corporations, and the police and all these institutions that, far right people only realized that they were angry about in November, for decades now. But all the same, that's the risk, I think. And that, for me, that's why I always say I'm an anarchist. I'm not just an anti-fascist. I'm an anarchist. I'm a proponent of a world in which power is distributed horizontally, in which we all do everything we can to give everyone a sense of their agency and access to the means they need with which to fulfill their potential on their own terms, and that and we should be able to articulate like that as a positive project. Yeah.
I'd say that's very different from a civil war.
Yeah, it is,
Well,
absolutely.
certainly, yeah.
You know, so the good news though is that, you know, in some parts of Europe, Antifa has been a really blurry thing that involves authoritarian communists and, you know, anarchists and people with all sorts of other weird ideologies. And honestly, in the United States, it was largely just anarchists, you know, with Antifa flags, you know, like it's just like a lot of anarchists from the beginning. And as more people got involved, anarchist politics also did like proliferate. The thing that I would say, when we're in a situation in which we're not just fighting fascists, right? We're also fighting the people from the political center, you know, the Democrats, the people who think that like Biden is the solution, the people who want immigration's customs and enforcement to like continue deporting people and imprisoning children. They just want it to happen in a slightly less embarrassing way. You know, the people who are fine with 2.5 million people in prison, you know, they just like don't want to have to hear about it, you know. And people who are fine with the US, like, you know, bombing other countries. They just don't want it happening with a president who embarrasses them, you know. Yeah. We're having to fight both of those forces. And
right.
The thing that I think that we need to formulate strategies for is understanding ourselves in three-sided conflicts, you know. Anti-fascism as a framework suggests a two-sided conflict between fascists and anti-fascists. But actually we have to understand ourselves as always being in struggles against at least two opponents at this point. And if we only strike one of those opponents, the other opponent will be very happy for us to do all the dirty work and then destroy us at the end. You know, this happened to the anarchists in the Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1921. And it's happened to some extent here also, where, you know, liberals were happy to just try over and over to do the Mueller investigation, some hopeless impeachment process, while anarchists, like, you know, got stabbed and arrested, you know, fighting like to make sure that when Trump supporters stormed the Capitol building, that there would only be hundreds of them rather than thousands and thousands and thousands, you know. No. So strategizing for this, we have to figure out every time we're defending against one adversary, we have to be able to hit both adversaries with every blow. This is a really important thing. So, you know, for example, like one of the things I know you were going to talk about and that we didn't get to talk about, but it's like, you know, monument toppling.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Like, you know, on some of the university campuses that have had monuments toppled, something that I've seen that was impressive is, you know, the like anti-racists would tear down a monument to the Confederacy or something, and then fascists would come and the police would be there, and there's, you know, the police would be like, well, you're criminals for tearing down the monument, but we're now like, you know, here to protect you from the fascists. And you have to be able to show that the police are the ones who are there to protect the fascists and are there to protect the monument, and that the monument is there because of the institutions of the university, of the state, you know, and and that the fascists are not the only ones who represent racism and patriarchy, white supremacy. You have to always be showing what your enemies have in common. You have to use any victory against one to discredit the other, and you have to do that in a way that doesn't leave room for one of them to say that their solution is better. You know, you can't create a situation in which people feel like there's an urgency to deal with fascist speech. So, you know, the censorship of all radical speech on all social media platforms is understood as the solution. You have to say, no, that the problem is authoritarian control, whether it's the kind that fascists are calling for or the social media companies being able to determine who can speak. You know, you have to say the problem is, you know, concentrations of state force, whether we're talking about, Trump deporting people or Biden deporting people. You have to be able to show that both of these adversaries are structurally the same, and show what is really different about our proposals. This is the strategic question that's called for, and that mere anti-fascism doesn't suffice to address the problem.
Yeah, one thing that I thought about earlier when we discussed it and didn't say was that, I also, when thinking about what fascism is, I think it's maybe not so useful to look at it as a political movement. But if you look what it is, maybe it's more useful to look at it as a kind of something more like the police, as a kind of a auxiliary police force or a paramilitary or something like this. I think maybe you can...
Right, advocacy for authoritarianism.
Yeah. I mean, also I remembered when I was talking with comrades from Greece, just an anecdote that they told me, when they have some big demonstration, anarchist or otherwise, anti-fascist demonstrations there that require the large presence of the police, there is no Golden Dawn Nazi counterattack, because most of them are at their jobs in their uniforms.
Exactly.
So, right.
Yeah.
They're identical. Yeah. They're identical with.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, yeah. That's the case we have to make to the public, and we have to show that the things that make some people think that they need a fascist movement against the deep state, and that make other people think that they need the state to control the violence. We need to show all of those people that the only real solution to the fundamental problems that are at the basis of that is a movement based in solidarity, bringing everybody together on the basis of our collective potential to create a dignified and meaningful life together.
Sounds good.
Absolutely.
Through anarchist struggle and love and togetherness. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with y'all. And
before we let you go,
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to say to listeners maybe who want to learn more about what you're working on now, where they can best get in touch with CrimethInc projects?
Yeah, you could just direct them to our website,
That'll be easy.
Yeah, and
All right.
and just the most important thing to direct people to is what each person who's listening can do themselves.
Dude.
Good luck to each of you. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
You. Hey there, Fritz here from The Empire Never Ended. This has been one of our weekly free episodes for free people. But for premium people, we also have weekly premium episodes, which you can get at patreon.com/tenepod, TENEPOD, and also follow our various social media things in the show description there. Like and subscribe them. Follow them. Like and follow and subscribe. Follow them. Do it.